Welcome back to Beneath the Surface, where we uncover the darkest corners of crime and reveal the stories that leave us questioning everything. Today, we bring you a harrowing tale of survival, desperation, and the consequences of pushing the limits of human endurance. In this chilling true crime story, a woman is thrust into a life-or-death situation that will test her every instinct. As the stakes grow higher, her struggle to survive takes a deadly turn. What lengths will she go to in order to escape? Will her fight for survival ultimately cost her everything? Stay with us as we unravel this gripping, heart-pounding journey into the unknown. Chapter 1. The Unexpected. Ambush Glenhaven had always been a quiet town. Nestled between two rolling hills, its picturesque streets were lined with cozy cottages, each one a symbol of safety and community. Everyone knew everyone, and the days passed with a kind of peaceful routine that only small towns could provide. Evelyn Matthews had lived here her entire life, a dedicated schoolteacher with a passion for helping children, and a woman who valued her peaceful existence above all. But on this particular evening, everything was about to change. Evelyn had stayed late at school, grading papers and preparing for the next day's lessons. The sun had already dipped behind the hills, casting a soft, amber glow over the landscape. As the last bell rang through the empty classrooms, she gathered her things, eager to head home. Her small cottage was just a mile away, and with the fading light she decided to take her usual shortcut through the woods to save time. She often walked this path, barely a dirt trail at the edge of the forest, but familiar and safe. Tonight, however, the air was different. The wind whispered through the trees, and a chill had begun to settle in. Evelyn pulled her coat tighter around her, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling creeping up her spine. She was accustomed to the sounds of the woods, the rustling leaves, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl. But tonight, everything felt too quiet. As she walked deeper into the forest, the evening sky darkened, and the shadows began to lengthen. That's when she first heard it, a faint rustle behind her, a sound that shouldn't have been there. At first, she dismissed it as nothing more than a rabbit darting through the underbrush, but then the footsteps came again, closer this time. Her heart skipped a beat, and she quickened her pace. There was no one she knew in these woods at this time of night. Was someone following her? A shiver ran down her spine. She glanced over her shoulder but saw nothing in the growing darkness. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. She urged herself to keep moving, her footsteps quickening with each passing second. That's when it happened. From the corner of her eye, Evelyn saw a flash of movement, a figure emerging from the shadows with terrifying speed. Before she could even process what was happening, the figure lunged at her, a glinting knife in his hand. She screamed, stumbling backward as the blade narrowly missed her side, grazing the sleeve of her jacket. Evelyn's breath hitched in her throat as she turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. The attacker's footsteps echoed behind her, growing louder and faster. She could feel him gaining on her, his breath hot and heavy on the back of her neck. There was no time to think, only to survive. Panic set in, and her legs felt like lead as she pushed through the thickening trees. The moon was hidden behind clouds now, and the darkness was suffocating. Evelyn's mind raced as she searched for a way to escape. Her body ached, her muscles burning with the effort, but the sound of the man's pursuit drove her forward. She rounded a bend in the path, her eyes darting around, searching for anything that might offer a way out. She saw a small creek up ahead, a familiar landmark she passed every evening on her walks. But it wasn't far enough. The man was too close. Her feet slipped on the wet ground, sending her crashing to the dirt. A sharp pain shot through her ankle, but she didn't have time to process it. She scrambled to her feet, determined to keep moving, but as she glanced over her shoulder, she saw the man coming closer. His eyes wild, his grin twisted with malice. He was gaining on her, and Evelyn knew that if she didn't do something soon, she wouldn't make it out of this alive. Her mind raced for a plan. Her phone was still in her bag, but there was no time to reach it. The woods were too quiet, and no one else was around to hear her screams. She had to think fast. Evelyn's gaze shifted to a large rock beside the creek. It wasn't much, but it was something. Something she could use to defend herself. She limped toward it, hoping against hope that the man didn't see her plan forming. She needed to buy herself time. As the man closed in on her, Evelyn turned and grabbed the rock with both hands. She swung it toward his face with every ounce of strength she could muster. The impact was enough to knock him off balance, but not enough to stop him entirely. He snarled, wiping the blood from his face as he stepped forward once more determined than ever to finish what he started. But Evelyn didn't wait for him to get any closer. With a burst of adrenaline, she pushed herself into the creek, splashing through the cold water and making her way to the other side. Her heart was racing and her thoughts were spinning, but all that mattered now was survival. Evelyn knew the fight had only just begun, and she would do whatever it took to escape. Chapter 2. The Desperate Struggle. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she scrambled through the murky waters of the creek, her breath shallow and erratic. The cold rush of water surged around her legs, numbing her skin, but the pain in her ankle was far worse. She could barely put weight on it, and the sharp, stabbing sensation only seemed to worsen with every step. But there was no time to stop. She glanced behind her, hoping that the man had been delayed by the creek, but the sound of his footsteps in the underbrush only grew louder. He was close, too close. Her mind raced, each thought sharper than the last. Where could she go? The forest was dense with trees, but they also created the perfect cover for her pursuer. She couldn't keep running blindly. She needed to think, to find something, anything that could turn the tables. The water rushing through the creek was only making her situation worse. The last thing she needed right now was to drown in the very creek she was hoping would provide her an escape. Her hand clutched the rock she had grabbed from the creek bed, its rough surface cutting into her palm. It was all she had, but Evelyn knew that she would have to use it wisely. She needed to find higher ground, somewhere with better visibility, somewhere she could plan her next move. There was a small rise to her right, an overgrown hillock that might offer some advantage. It wasn't much, but it was the best she had. With gritted teeth, Evelyn dragged her injured leg forward, ignoring the pain that shot up her ankle with each step. She stumbled onto the small hill, her breath coming in short gasps as she hoisted herself up the muddy incline. She reached the top and collapsed on the ground, desperate for a moment's respite. Her entire body was shaking, and her head spun from the effort of running and hiding. The man had not followed immediately. That small distance had given her some much-needed time. Evelyn crouched low, her breath catching in her throat as she listened for his footsteps. The woods were eerily silent for a moment. Perhaps he had lost her. Maybe the creek had been enough to slow him down. Maybe. But then the sound of movement broke the silence. She quickly hid behind a large, knotted tree trunk, peering around it with wide, fearful eyes. Through the thick trees, she saw him, her attacker, stalking the ground, his eyes scanning the area with an unnerving precision. He moved with a predator's grace, the knife in his hand glinting faintly in the moonlight. A rush of panic flooded Evelyn's chest. She was cornered. She could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her. Her only option now was to keep as still as possible and pray that he didn't spot her. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as she held her breath, praying he wouldn't see her. But the man was relentless. He moved closer, step by step, his heavy boots crunching against the dry leaves. Evelyn's heart thundered in her ears and she fought the urge to make a sound. She watched as he walked right past her hiding spot, his eyes darting to the trees around him. But his gaze didn't linger. He was focused, his mind clearly calculating his next move. Evelyn was mere inches from him now, so close she could hear his labored breathing. The seconds seemed to drag on, and Evelyn could feel the heat of fear in her chest. Was this it? Would this be where her story ended? And then she saw it. The moonlight filtered through the branches above, casting a soft glow on a branch nearby, one that jutted out just enough for her to reach it. It wasn't much, but it was something. As the man continued moving, Evelyn acted quickly, reaching up and grabbing the branch. She used it to pull herself into a crouched position, hiding as best as she could. Her ankles screamed in protest, but she forced herself to ignore the pain. She had to stay hidden, but just as she thought she had evaded him, the man stopped dead. In his tracks. He turned around, his eyes narrowing. Evelyn held her breath, praying he hadn't seen her. The silence was unbearable. The man stood still for a moment, scanning the trees. She was sure he could feel her presence, even if he couldn't see her. The seconds stretched into eternity. She could hear her pulse in her ears, could feel every muscle in her body tensing, waiting for the inevitable. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, the man lunged forward with a sudden, forceful motion. He had found her. Evelyn screamed, throwing the rock in her hand at him with all the strength she could muster. It hit him square in the chest, but it was nothing more than a distraction. He snarled, his hand grasping her wrist before she could react. For the second time that night, Evelyn found herself fighting for her life. This time, there would be no hiding, no more running. With all her remaining strength, she pulled away from him, using her other hand to claw at his face, trying to get free. His grip on her tightened, but Evelyn wasn't about to give up. She kicked at his shins, her ankle on fire, but it didn't matter. She had to survive. Her eyes darted around in a frenzy looking for anything she could use. And then she saw it. Just ahead, a thin sapling with a sharp, jagged edge. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot she had. With one final, desperate surge of energy, Evelyn reached forward, grabbing the sharp sapling and driving it into the man's side. His grip faltered, and for a moment, she thought she might have succeeded. But the fight was far from over. Chapter 3. The turning point. Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps as she pulled the jagged sapling out of the man's side, her hands slick with his blood. The shock in his eyes, mingled with a flash of pain, was enough to make her stomach turn. He staggered back, his grip on her wrist loosening for just a moment, and that was all she needed. With a guttural cry, Evelyn yanked her arm free and scrambled backward, her heart racing in her chest. She had no plan, no clear direction. The only thing she could think of was getting away from him, away from the predator who was determined to end her life tonight. Her ankle burned with every step, but the adrenaline coursing through her veins made her feel invincible. The man was still reeling, clutching his side, but he wasn't out of the fight yet. He grunted, his eyes narrowing with a terrifying resolve. Evelyn didn't wait to see what he would do next. She turned and bolted, moving as quickly as her injured leg would allow. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow on the dark path ahead. The trees seemed to close in around her, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. But she couldn't think about that now. All she could focus on was putting as much distance between herself and the man as possible. Her mind raced, but she couldn't think straight. Panic clouded her judgment, and with every step the world around her blurred. She had no idea where she was going, only that she needed to run. The sound of heavy footsteps behind her cut through the night, and she knew that he was still following. He wasn't far behind. She could hear his labored breath, his angry muttering under his breath. The chase was far from over. Evelyn's leg throbbed in pain, and each step felt like an eternity. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't give him the chance to catch up. She knew that if he did, it would be the end of her. Just ahead, she saw a clearing in the trees. The glow of distant lights suggested that she was nearing the edge of the forest, near the outskirts of town. Her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't far from safety. If she could make it to the main road, she might be able to flag down a car, call for help. Her body screamed in protest as she pushed herself forward, but she refused to slow down. Every step was a fight against the pain, the fear, the exhaustion. Then, just as she reached the edge of the clearing, she heard a snap behind her, the unmistakable sound of a twig breaking underfoot. The man had gained ground. He was close. Too close. Without warning, he lunged at her again, his hand grabbing a fistful of her hair. Evelyn screamed, her body jerking in response to the sudden force. He yanked her backward, and she lost her footing, crashing to the ground. For a moment, everything went black as her head hit the dirt. The world spun around her as she lay there, dazed and disoriented. She could hear the man's footsteps approaching, but they sounded distant, muffled, as if they were coming from a place far away. When her vision cleared, she saw him looming over her, his eyes gleaming with malice. He raised the knife, and Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She was pinned. There was nowhere to go. For a split second, all she could think about was how her life had come to this moment, how a quiet walk through the woods had turned into a nightmare. She wasn't ready to die. She couldn't be. But then something inside her snapped. A wave of determination surged through her, stronger than the fear that had gripped her moments before. She wasn't going to die here. Not like this. Not without a fight. With all the strength she could muster, Evelyn shoved the man's hand away, knocking the knife from his grasp. She rolled onto her back, desperate to get away, but the man was fast. He lunged again, but this time, Evelyn was ready. She kicked out with all her might, connecting with his chest. He staggered back, the wind knocked out of him. It was her chance. Evelyn scrambled to her feet, ignoring the sharp pain in her ankle. She didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. The clearing was within reach. The road was just beyond it. She could see the glow of headlights in the distance. Cars were passing by. "Help!" she screamed, her voice raw from terror and exertion. "Please!" But the man wasn't giving up. He was charging at her now, faster than ever, his eyes wild with rage. He wouldn't stop until he had her. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she pushed herself to move faster, but her body was betraying her. The pain in her ankle was unbearable now, each step sending shockwaves of agony through her leg. The road was so close, she could almost reach it. And then, just as she thought she couldn't go any further, she heard it, the screeching tires of a car slamming on its brakes. "Get in!" a voice shouted. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She ran, limping and gasping, but the road was now within her grasp. She made it. She dove into the car, the door slamming shut behind her. The engine roared to life, and the car sped off into the night. Evelyn collapsed against the seat, her body trembling with exhaustion, her mind racing. She had survived. For now. But the man. The nightmare wasn't over. Chapter 4. The Chase. Continues Evelyn's heart was still pounding in her chest, the aftershocks of the terrifying chase vibrating through her bones. The car sped down the dark road, the headlights cutting through the night as the driver swerved around curves, trying to put as much distance between them and the woods as possible. She glanced over at the driver, her mind racing. She didn't recognize him. His face was a blur, his expression focused on the road. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. Evelyn couldn't respond immediately. She could only nod, her eyes wide as she tried to catch her breath. She was alive, barely, but the relief was short-lived. The terror still gripped her, a cold knot in her stomach that wouldn't loosen. "You need to pull over," Evelyn gasped, her voice shaky. "He's still out there. He'll come after me. You don't understand. He's dangerous." The driver shot her a quick glance before returning his attention to the road. "I'm not letting you out until we reach the station. We'll be safe there." Evelyn's stomach twisted. The thought of being anywhere near law enforcement was terrifying. She didn't know who she could trust anymore. The man who had attacked her might be closer than they realized. He could be waiting. He could. A sudden screech of tires interrupted her spiraling thoughts. She turned her head just in time to see a dark figure emerging from the trees behind them. The man. He had somehow found them, and the nightmare was far from over. The driver slammed on the brakes, swerving the car to the side in an attempt to evade the oncoming threat. Evelyn's heart nearly stopped as she was thrown forward, her head hitting the seat in front of her. She cried out in pain, but there was no time to worry about that. The car came to a screeching halt. "Get out of here!" she screamed, her voice raw and filled with desperation. The man was closing in fast, and they were sitting ducks. Without thinking, she opened the door and bolted out of the car, ignoring the sharp sting in her ankle. The woods were her only option now. The adrenaline was still pumping, driving her forward, making her move faster than she thought possible. The man wasn't far behind. She could hear his heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush, the sound of his breath like a growl in the distance. He was relentless. The driver's voice came from behind her, but she didn't stop to listen. She couldn't. There was no time. She was running again, her heart in her throat as she pushed herself to go further, faster. The trees blurred around her as she weaved through them, desperately searching for any sign of safety. Her mind was clouded, her thoughts scattered. She couldn't think straight anymore. Her only focus was getting away. And then, there it was, a clearing. The same clearing she had passed earlier, the one that had seemed like a beacon of safety. She wasn't sure how far she had run, but she had to be close to the main road. She had to be. Her legs felt like lead as she pushed herself forward, but she refused to stop. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but she ignored it. She had to survive. The man was closing in again, but this time, Evelyn had a plan. She veered sharply to the left, ducking behind a thick cluster of trees. She flattened herself against the rough bark, holding her breath as she waited, her body trembling with fear. The footsteps grew louder, then slower, then stopped entirely. She peeked through the branches, holding her breath as she watched the man walk right past her hiding spot. She was nearly shaking with relief, but she couldn't let her guard down yet. He wasn't done. Evelyn waited, every muscle tense, watching him closely. He moved in circles as if trying to sniff her out, but she had outsmarted him for now. She had to be patient, to stay hidden, to keep herself alive. And then, to her horror, the man stopped. He turned around and began walking directly toward her hiding spot. "Please," she whispered, her hands shaking. "Please don't find me." But her prayers went unanswered. The man's eyes locked onto hers through the trees, and his lips curled into a twisted grin. "I know you're there," he said, his voice cold and sinister. "You can't hide from me forever." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she realized there was no escape. Chapter 5. Trapped in the woods, Evelyn didn't have time to think. Panic surged through her body as she turned and ran in the opposite direction, her legs pumping furiously despite the pain in her ankle. The man was coming for her, and this time, he wasn't going to let her get away. The trees whipped past her as she sprinted through the woods, her heart racing in her chest. The world around her was a blur of shadows and noise, branches scraping against her arms, leaves crunching underfoot, the thudding of her own heart in her ears. But even in her frantic state, her mind kept racing, trying to think of a way out. She needed to find something, anything, that could give her the upper hand. Her eyes darted around, searching for anything that could help her. And then, just ahead, she saw it. A steep incline that led to a rocky outcrop above. She had no idea how far up it went, but it was her only chance. If she could get to the top, maybe she could finally escape him. She pushed herself harder, ignoring the burning pain in her legs, ignoring the fear that gnawed at her insides. She had to get to the top. She had to survive. The incline was steep and treacherous, but Evelyn wasn't thinking about the danger. She was thinking only of the man behind her, gaining on her with every step. She climbed, her hands scraping against the rocks, her body trembling with exhaustion, but she didn't stop. Finally, she reached the top, her chest heaving as she pulled herself over the edge. She stumbled to her feet, her gaze sweeping over the darkened landscape. The town was far behind her now, but the man was still down below, pacing back and forth like a wild animal, searching for her. But Evelyn wasn't going to give up. Not yet. She had to make it out. She had to. Chapter 6. The Final Confrontation. Evelyn's mind raced as she looked out over the vast stretch of the forest below her. She had reached the rocky outcrop, but there was no escape. She was cornered. The town was too far away for her to reach on foot, and the forest stretched on endlessly in every direction. She couldn't keep running forever, and even if she did manage to find a way out, she wasn't sure how much longer her body could take. The pain in her ankle had worsened, each step sending a jolt of agony through her leg. The blood from her earlier injury had soaked through her jacket sleeve, but it was the exhaustion that weighed on her the most. Her body felt like it was betraying her, each breath harder than the last. She needed a plan. She needed time to think, but the man was still out there, still hunting her. She crouched behind a large boulder at the edge of the outcrop, trying to steady her breathing. The sounds of the forest around her seemed to grow louder, more oppressive. The wind rustled through the trees, and in the distance she could hear the faint crackle of leaves underfoot. He was coming. She peered over the boulder, her eyes scanning the woods below. There was no sign of him yet, but she knew it was only a matter of time. He was too close, too relentless. The sound of footsteps grew louder as he approached. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She could hear him muttering to himself, the words indistinguishable but the tone filled with rage. She had to move. She couldn't let him catch her here, but the outcrop offered no cover. There was nowhere to hide. She would have to face him head-on. Suddenly, she had an idea. A flash of memory came to her. A sharp rock just behind her. It wasn't much, but it was sharp enough to do some damage. If she could just get to it in time, she might have a chance. With all the strength she had left, Evelyn pushed herself up and moved quickly, limping toward the sharp rock. She picked it up, feeling its jagged edges cut into her palm. It wasn't a knife, but it would have to do. The sound of the man's footsteps was now deafening, and she knew that he was close. He wasn't giving up. He never would. She turned and faced the direction of the approaching footsteps, her heart pounding in her chest. As the man emerged from the trees, Evelyn took a deep breath and raised the sharp rock, holding it tightly in her hand. The man stopped, a cruel smile spreading across his face as he saw her standing there, her eyes wild with fear and determination. "You really think you can stop me with that?" he sneered, taking a step closer. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat, but she held her ground. "I'll do whatever it takes to survive," she spat, her voice trembling but defiant. The man laughed, a low, mocking sound. "You're already dead, lady. You just don't know it yet." And with that, he lunged at her. In that moment, everything slowed down. The world around her became a blur of motion, and all Evelyn could think about was survival. She swung the rock at his face with all her strength, but he dodged it, grabbing her wrist before the blow could land. For a moment, they struggled, the man's grip like iron as he twisted her arm. Evelyn screamed, the pain in her wrist nearly unbearable. She kicked at him, but he was too strong. She was losing this fight. But then, she remembered something. A detail she had almost forgotten. The man's side, where she had struck him with the sapling earlier, was still exposed. With a burst of strength, Evelyn brought her knee up hard, hitting him square in the ribs. The man grunted in pain, loosening his grip for just a second. That was all she needed. She broke free, stumbling backward, and before he could recover, she swung the rock again, this time connecting with his temple. The man staggered, his eyes widening in shock as he fell to the ground with a sickening thud. For a moment, there was silence. Evelyn stood over him, her body shaking with exhaustion, the blood from her injuries staining her clothes. She didn't know if he was dead, but she didn't care. He wasn't going to hurt her anymore. She collapsed to the ground, her breathing ragged, and stared at the man's still body. The world around her felt unreal, distant. She had done it. She had survived. But at what cost? Chapter 7. The Aftermath. The stillness of the woods was almost peaceful in the wake of the battle, but Evelyn's mind was far from calm. Her hands trembled as she sat on the ground, her body aching in ways she didn't know were possible. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind only exhaustion and pain. She stared at the man's unmoving body, a knot of fear tightening in her chest. She didn't know if he was dead or unconscious, but she couldn't take any chances. She couldn't let her guard down. Not yet, but there was no time to figure that out now. She needed to get out of the woods, to find help. She had fought for her life, but she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep going. Evelyn pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaking as she stood. She felt dizzy from the blood loss, her vision blurring in and out. But she refused to fall. Not now. She turned back to the path she had come from, her mind racing as she tried to remember where she had seen the nearest road. The town had to be close. It had to be. But when she stepped forward, something caught her attention. The man's breathing. It was faint but unmistakable. Evelyn froze, her heart in her throat. He wasn't dead. She turned to face him, her body swaying as she raised the sharp rock once again. But before she could make another move, she heard the sound of distant sirens. The cavalry had arrived. The sound of sirens grew louder, and Evelyn felt a wave of relief wash over her. She wasn't alone anymore. Someone was coming to help. She lowered the rock in her hand and stumbled toward the edge of the outcrop, her heart still racing. The sound of the sirens wasn't just a sign of rescue, it was a sign that the nightmare might finally be over. The lights from a police car flashed in the distance, cutting through the trees like a beacon. Evelyn's legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed onto the ground. The sirens were so close now, and she could hear the voices of officers calling out to her. She opened her mouth to shout, but all that came out was a dry, hoarse rasp. She tried again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here," she croaked, her throat raw from screaming earlier. "Help me." Within seconds, 2 officers appeared at her side, their hands reaching out to steady her. One of them helped her to her feet, supporting her as she swayed. "We got you," the officer said, his voice calm but filled with urgency. "You're safe now." As the officers guided her away from the clearing, Evelyn let herself believe it. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to relax, to let go of the fear that had held her captive for so long. But even as the officers led her to safety, a lingering question remained in her mind. Was the nightmare truly over? Or had the man simply been one of many who would continue to hunt her? Chapter 8. The rescue, Evelyn was placed into the back of the police car, her legs still shaky, and her mind a blur. She hadn't spoken much since the officers found her, but they had reassured her that she would be taken to safety and that everything was going to be okay. She wanted to believe them, but something deep inside told her it wasn't over. The drive to the police station was a quiet one. She stared out the window, watching the dark trees pass by as they sped towards civilization. But she wasn't sure what kind of life awaited her after this. Would she ever be able to walk through those woods again? Would she ever feel safe again? When they arrived at the station, she was taken inside and placed in a small room to wait while the officers processed the scene. Evelyn couldn't sit still. She walked around the room, rubbing her hands together, trying to calm herself. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the man's twisted face, heard his voice, felt the grip of his hands on her. But there was a part of her, a small part, that was starting to feel something else. Relief. There was a glimmer of hope. She had made it out. She was alive. After a few minutes, a detective entered the room. He was tall and lean, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything in one glance. He introduced himself as Detective Carter and asked her to sit down. "Evelyn, I know this has been difficult, but I need to ask you some questions," he said gently. "You've been through a lot, but your statement will help us piece everything together." Evelyn nodded, still feeling numb but willing to cooperate. She wasn't sure how much she could remember, but she would try. "Tell me what happened," Detective Carter asked. His voice was calm and steady, like he had done this 100 times before. Evelyn took a deep breath and began recounting everything: the walk through the woods, the sudden appearance of the man, the fight for her life, the desperate struggle to escape. She told him everything she could remember, from the moment the man attacked her to when she had been rescued. As she spoke, she began to realize something she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge before. She had been strong. She had survived. And she had done it all on her own. When she finished, the detective nodded, taking notes in his file. "We'll be in touch," he said, standing up. "You did great, Evelyn. You've been incredibly brave." Evelyn watched him leave, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. She had made it through the worst of it. Now, she would have to find a way to heal, to move on. But that was a battle for another day. Chapter 9. The Investigation. The next few days were a blur of police interviews, hospital visits, and sleepless nights. The man who had attacked Evelyn was still the focus of the investigation, and the authorities were trying to piece together his identity. She had learned that his name was Jason Harrington, and he had been living off the grid for several years, hiding from the law. The detective had explained that Jason had a history of violent behavior, but there was no clear connection between him and Evelyn. He had apparently chosen her at random, a victim of opportunity in his twisted pursuit. But Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. Why had he targeted her? What had made her the person he chose to pursue so relentlessly? Those questions lingered in her mind, unanswered, even as the weeks went by. As much as she wanted to move on, to put the events of that night behind her, the questions kept resurfacing, and every time she closed her eyes she could still see his face, still hear his voice, still feel the terror that had nearly destroyed her. The investigation continued, but the answers she needed weren't coming. It was as if Jason had appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as quickly. There was no closure, no explanation. But Evelyn had to learn to accept that. Some questions didn't have answers. Some things would never make sense. She had to let go of the need for all the answers and focus on what she had: her life, her survival. And with that, Evelyn began to rebuild. Chapter 10. Moving Forward. The days turned into weeks, and slowly Evelyn found herself moving forward. The nightmares still came, but they were less frequent now. Her ankle had healed, and she had resumed her teaching job, though she couldn't deny that it felt different. The children, their innocent faces, reminded her of what she had lost: her sense of safety, her sense of normalcy. But she wasn't broken. She was still standing, still moving forward. Evelyn started attending therapy, determined to reclaim her life. She talked about the attack, about the fear, about everything she had been through. She learned to face her trauma head-on, to work through the emotions she had buried deep inside. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And slowly, she began to feel like herself again. One evening, several months after the attack, Evelyn found herself standing at the edge of the forest once more. The same woods that had nearly claimed her life now seemed different. The trees still whispered in the wind. The creek still ran through the clearing, but she was no longer afraid. She had survived. She had fought. And she had won. The darkness might always be lurking beneath the surface, but Evelyn had learned to live with it, to move forward despite it. And in that moment, she knew that nothing could ever take away her strength. As Evelyn stood at the edge of the forest, looking out over the familiar yet forever changed landscape, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. What she had endured, what she had survived, was something she never thought possible. The pain, the fear, the uncertainty, it had been overwhelming. But she had emerged from it stronger, wiser, and more determined to live her life to the fullest. The man who had attacked her, the terror he had brought into her life, was a shadow now, a nightmare that had faded with time. But his presence had left a lasting impact on her. She had learned things about herself that she never knew existed. Her strength, her resilience, her capacity to survive even in the most hopeless of situations. The lessons Evelyn had learned were hard-earned but invaluable. Survival is not just physical, it's mental and emotional. Evelyn's fight wasn't just against her attacker, it was against fear, despair, and helplessness. Surviving something so traumatic required not just physical endurance but the ability to confront and manage the overwhelming emotions that came with it. There is power in taking control. In the midst of a life-threatening situation, Evelyn didn't just rely on luck or hope. She took action. She fought back, made choices, and took control of the outcome. This experience taught her that even in the face of terror, there is always a way to fight for survival. The road to healing is long, but it's worth it. After the attack, Evelyn was faced with a long road to recovery, both physically and emotionally. But healing, though challenging, was possible. Through therapy, self-reflection, and the support of loved ones, she began to rebuild her life. The process wasn't easy, but it was necessary for her peace of mind and for reclaiming her life. You are stronger than you think. Through her struggle, Evelyn learned that human beings have an incredible capacity for strength. When pushed to the limits, people often surprise themselves with what they can endure and overcome. Evelyn's survival proved that even in the darkest moments, the strength to keep fighting resides within each of us. There is always light, even in the darkest of times. The most important lesson Evelyn learned was that no matter how dire the circumstances, there is always hope. It may be hard to see at first, buried beneath layers of fear and pain, but with time, the light always finds a way through. Evelyn had survived, and she was stronger because of it. She could face whatever came next, because she knew she could handle it. As Evelyn stepped away from the forest, ready to embrace her future, she carried these lessons with her. The woods would no longer hold the same terror. Instead, they were a symbol of her strength, a reminder that no matter how dark the world seemed, she had the power to overcome it. The journey wasn't over. It never truly is. But Evelyn knew one thing for sure. She was ready to face whatever came next. Thank you for watching Beneath the Surface, the dark side of crime. Evelyn's journey is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the darkest of times we can find the strength to fight, to survive, and to rebuild. If you've enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and subscribe for more gripping tales that dive deep into the heart of crime and survival. Remember, the truth often lies just beneath the surface.